There is a kind of knowledge that does not come from books. I have spent a good portion of my life around books, farm journals, timber catalogs, the engineering manuals that started arriving from back east in the 1880s, thick with diagrams and the confident language of men who had studied things in warm rooms. I read them carefully. I built by them for 30 years. I drove a nail into Montana pine in every season this territory offers, which is to say I drove nails in cold that made the wood ring like iron, and in heat that raised the pitch out of fresh-cut lumber until the whole frame smelled like a forest on fire. I knew my trade. I was not a man who suffered from false modesty about it. And then, in the autumn of 1883, I stood in front of a structure built by a woman I had never met and spent 2 hours explaining to her, in considerable technical detail, why it would not survive the winter. I was 41 years old. I had been building in Montana Territory for 19 years. I was wrong about nearly everything I said that afternoon. My name is Hjalmar Eriksson. Most people who have known me longer than a week call me Hal. I am telling you this story in the summer of 1923, sitting on the porch of the house I built for myself in Miles City the year Montana became a state. My nephew Arvid is here. He arrived last Tuesday from Billings, 20 years old, heading east in the fall to study construction engineering at a college that didn't exist when I was his age. He asked me yesterday what was the finest piece of work I'd seen in 40 years of building on the northern plains. I put down the chair leg I was sanding. I thought about it longer than he expected. The finest piece of work, I told him, was not mine. You need to understand what a Montana winter asks of a building before you can understand what Marta Vasquez answered. The winters along the Yellowstone River Valley in the early 1880s were not the worst on record, but they were honest about what they were. From November through March, the temperature dropped below zero with the regularity of a creditor coming to collect. The January cold snaps, the ones that came in clear weather, no wind, no snow, just a stillness that descended over the grassland like a held breath. Those could push 40 below zero and stay there for 3 and 4 days at a time. That kind of cold does not announce itself with noise. That is what makes it dangerous. A blizzard gives you wind, gives you sound, gives you something to push back against. A clear freeze just settles, quiet as a blanket, and takes what it wants. The settlers who came up into that country in the late 1870s and early 1880s built the way they had built in Minnesota or Wisconsin or the German states they'd crossed an ocean to leave behind. Timber frame houses, vertical plank siding, windows sized for light and not for heat retention, roof lines designed to shed rain in climates where rain was the thing to worry about. Good houses, many of them, sound construction by the standards they'd been taught. But those standards had been developed for different places. A timber frame house in a Montana winter is, at its fundamental nature, a box of trapped air. You heat the air inside. The air inside leaks out through every joint, every window frame, every gap where the settling of the first year has opened a seam between board and board. The walls conduct cold from outside to, in the way a metal spoon conducts heat from soup to hand. You put more wood on the fire. The wood burns, the heat rises, the heat escapes, the cold comes back. It is a conversation with no resolution, and the woodpile is the only currency that keeps it going. Lars Lindqvist, who was by general agreement the best-housed man in our section of the valley, burned between 38 and 45 pounds of wood every day through a Montana winter. He had a good stove, tight construction, and 4 years of experience knowing exactly how much wood it took. He also had to start cutting timber in July to have enough by November, and some years July came late after a wet spring and the arithmetic got uncomfortable. Most families were not as well prepared as Lars. The ones who arrived late in the season or came with less capital than they'd estimated or simply built faster than they built well. Those families spent their winters in a state of slow emergency, measuring their wood supply against the remaining months like a man dividing the last of his water in a dry crossing. 2 people died in our area the winter of 1882. An old man whose son had gone back to Wisconsin and who had no one to split wood once his hands gave out. A child, 18 months old, in a claim shack on the eastern bench that might as well have been a canvas tent for all the warmth the walls held. This was the problem Marta Vasquez arrived into in September of 1883. I did not meet her the day she came into the valley. I heard about her before I saw her, the way you heard about most things in a community stretched thin across 10 miles of river bottom. Someone mentioned her to someone else at the general store, and the information arrived at my workbench the next morning in the form of Gunnar Peterson telling me that a Mexican woman had taken the old Cary quarter section east of the Oxbow Bend. A Mexican woman, he said, as though the 2 words together constituted a complete assessment of the situation. I did not think much about it. I had 3 window frames to finish for the Hofer family's new storehouse, and the weather was turning, and I wanted them done before the first hard frost. It was Lars Lindqvist who told me more a week later. Lars was a Swede, 50 years old, had come to Montana Territory in 1879 with enough money to build properly and enough stubbornness to stay when the first winter tried to persuade him otherwise. He was not an unkind man. He was a practical man, which in that country meant he had learned to strip a situation down to its structural elements and address those directly. "She has children," Lars said, 2 of them, a girl and a small boy, and she is planning to build into the riverbank. I looked up from my workbench. "Into it," I said. "Into it," Lars said. "She has stakes up on the south face of the old cut bank above the Oxbow. She told Ingrid she is going to dig 9 feet back and build a room inside the earth." I set down my plane. In 30 years of building, I had seen root cellars, storm shelters, potato pits, and one underground smokehouse a Bohemian family had built near Glendive that collapsed in the spring thaw of its 2nd year. I had a professional's familiarity with the problems of underground construction: moisture, structural load on unsupported earth ceilings, air quality. The way a space without adequate ventilation became, over weeks, something closer to a slow suffocation than a home. "She has experience with this kind of building?" I asked. Lars shook his head. "Her father was an adobe man in Texas. She says she learned from him. But adobe is desert work. This is Montana." I told Lars I would ride out and take a look. The cut bank above the Oxbow Bend on the Cary quarter section is a feature of the landscape that I had ridden past perhaps 50 times without giving it particular attention. It was a natural erosion face, 8 or 10 feet high, where the river's old course had eaten into the higher ground before shifting south. The face ran roughly east to west, and the top of the bank caught the southern exposure, which is to say, in winter, it caught what sun there was for the longest part of the short days. Marta Vasquez was standing at the base of it with a survey stake in one hand and a small leather-bound notebook in the other when I rode up. My first impression was of a woman who was doing several things at once in her head and did not intend to stop doing them because a stranger had arrived on horseback. She glanced at me, returned her attention to the bank face, made a notation, and then looked up again with the composed expression of someone who had already decided how much of her time this interruption deserved. She was perhaps 34 or 35 years old, dark-haired, dark-eyed, wearing a canvas work coat that had been mended at both elbows. Her 2 children were nearby, a girl of 7 or 8 with a wool muffler tied over her nose and mouth, and a smaller boy who was digging in the loose soil at the base of the bank with a stick, apparently for the pleasure of it. I introduced myself. I told her I was the primary carpenter in the area and that Lars Lindqvist had mentioned her plans. She said her name was Marta Vasquez and that she was glad to meet me and that she was just finishing her measurements if I cared to wait. I waited. I looked at her survey stakes. She had marked a rectangle on the bank face, 12 feet wide, positioned to center on a section of the cut bank that was, I noticed after a moment, the section that faced most directly south. Not merely south-facing, precisely south-facing. She had taken care with this. When she closed her notebook and came to stand beside me, I asked her what she was planning. She told me clearly and without excessive elaboration. She was going to excavate 9 feet into the bank, 12 feet wide, 16 feet deep. The walls would be adobe brick, 36 inches thick, built in the opening and against the earthen sides. The floor would be packed earth mixed with wood ash, sloped slightly toward the entrance. The ceiling would follow a gentle curve, gable-cut poles from the cottonwood stand half a mile downstream, topped with a lattice of willow branches, then 12 inches of tamped earth. The stove would be built into the rear wall using her father's method. A hornito, she called it, a Pueblo-style firebox constructed as part of the wall itself, so that the heat from burning passed into the adobe mass rather than directly into the air. I listened to all of this. I asked my questions. I asked about moisture. Underground spaces in the Yellowstone Valley ran wet in spring, and wet walls in a living space produced the kind of air that settled into lungs and stayed. She told me the floor slope would handle drainage and that the thick adobe wall, once dried and sealed with a final layer of fine clay mixed with sand, would not wick moisture the way raw earth did. Her father had built wells in San Antonio using the same sealing method, and they had stayed dry for 20 years. I asked about structural load. 12 inches of tamped earth on a willow and pole ceiling was considerable weight, and the spanning distance she was proposing was not small. She told me the curve of the ceiling distributed the load to the sidewalls rather than concentrating it at the center. This was, she said, the same reason a clay pot did not collapse under its own contents. I had not thought about ceiling geometry in those terms before, and I filed it away in the back of my mind without acknowledging that I had done so. I asked about the stove design. A firebox built into the wall was something I associated with European masonry construction, and I knew its limitations. She said the hornito was not a European fireplace. It was a Pueblo design, and it worked differently. The fire burned inside the earth mass of the wall. The wall absorbed the heat. The wall released the heat slowly, over hours, into the room. You were not heating the air in the room directly. You were heating the wall, and the wall heated the room. The fire could go out at midnight, and the wall would still be giving back warmth at 4 in the morning. I stood there for a moment. I knew about thermal mass in the general way that a working builder knows things. I knew that stone held heat longer than wood, that a brick chimney stayed warm after the fire died, that earthen floors were cool in summer. But I had never heard someone describe a wall as a storage vessel for heat, in quite the way she described it, as though the wall were a thing you charged up in the evening and spent down through the night. "You're 9 feet deep," I said finally. "The cold air, it sinks. You will be collecting the coldest air in the valley down in that excavation." She shook her head, not impatiently. "Below 8 feet," she said. "The earth in this valley does not freeze in winter, not even in January. My father taught me to test this. You dig a hole in early autumn and hold the soil in your hand. Soil below the freeze line is warmer than the air. This bank here," she touched the face of the cut bank, "holds around 52 or 53 degrees at 9 feet down. In January, in July, it does not change quickly. I am not fighting the cold. I am building inside something that is already warm." The girl with the wool muffler had come to stand beside her mother while we talked. She pulled the muffler down below her chin. "Will it work, Mama?" she asked. "Yes," her mother said. I was not as certain as she was. I had seen too many things that should have worked fail when a Montana winter had its say. But I could not find in anything she had described to me the fatal error I had ridden out there expecting to find. The principles were coherent. The techniques were unfamiliar to me, but not obviously wrong. The design addressed problems I knew were real. What I told her was this: the concept was interesting, but the execution would determine everything, and I had concerns about the ceiling load and the moisture management and the performance of an adobe wall in a wet spring. What I did not tell her was this: I had taken a small thermometer from my coat pocket while we were talking and had pressed it against the face of the cut bank at roughly the height of my chest. The reading was 54 degrees. The air temperature that morning was 31. I put the thermometer back in my pocket and rode home to finish the Hofer window frames. That evening, I opened my workbook to a fresh page and wrote 2 words at the top of it. I wrote, Vasquez method. Then I left the rest of the page blank because I did not yet know what to put there. But I knew, in the way a man who has worked with materials for 30 years knows when something is not behaving the way he assumed it would, that I was going to be coming back to that page. The girl's name was Rosa. She was 7 years old, and she had been coughing since the previous winter. Not the sharp cough of a child with a fever, but the low, persistent cough of someone whose lungs had been cold for too long and had not quite forgotten it. Her mother had noticed, as mothers notice everything, that Rosa coughed more in the morning and more in the evening, the hours when the temperature in their temporary shelter dropped the sharpest. That was what Marta Vasquez was building. Not a homestead claim, not a proof of principle, not an argument with her neighbors about construction methods. She was building a room that would not make her daughter cough. Everything else followed from that. There is a question I have been asked many times over the years by people who heard the story secondhand and wanted the piece of it that felt most like a story should feel. The question is, where did she learn it? People ask this as though there must be a single moment, a wise elder, a discovered book, a revelation arrived at in the manner of a dream. They want the knowledge to have come from somewhere specific, the way a river can be traced back to a particular spring in a particular hillside. It makes the whole thing feel more comprehensible, more like something that could happen again, to someone else, if they could only find the same spring. The honest answer is more complicated than that, and I think Marta herself would tell you so if she were here. She would probably say it with less ceremony than I am using, because she was not a woman who spent much time dressing up what was true. The knowledge came from several places at once. It came from her father, and from her husband, and from the boy she hired to help her dig, and from the cut bank itself, which had its own things to say if you were willing to spend 3 mornings asking it questions. Her father's name was Ernesto Ibarra. He had been a builder of adobe structures in and around San Antonio for the better part of 30 years. Not a grand architect, not a man whose work was written about or remembered by name, but a craftsman who had built water cisterns and storage rooms and the thick-walled back quarters of ranch houses for families who wanted their food cool and their water accessible through August in South Texas. Marta had followed him to work sites from the time she was old enough to carry a bucket. She had mixed clay by hand, had learned to test the consistency by feel. 3 fingers pressed into a fresh mixed batch, pulled free. If the holes held their shape and did not slump, the mix was right. She had watched her father lay courses of dried brick with the patience of a man who understood that the wall was going to outlast him and deserved to be built accordingly. She had seen him seal finished surfaces with a final coat of fine clay and sand and a small measure of ground limestone that hardened in the sun to something approaching stone. Her father never explained the science of what he built. He explained the practice. He told her that thick walls kept the interior cool because the sun's heat had to travel a long way through the clay before it reached the living space, and by the time it arrived, the day was already cooling and the heat was no longer wanted on the outside either. He told her that the same principle ran in reverse in winter, that warmth generated inside a thick wall did not leave quickly, because thickness was thickness, regardless of which direction the temperature was flowing. She told me this one afternoon in November, sitting outside her completed doorway in the thin winter sun, watching Tomas chase a ground squirrel across the frost-hardened grass. I had come out again with my workbook and no particular excuse. She had stopped pretending she needed one. He never said thermal mass, she said. He never said heat storage or conductivity or any of those words. He said, the wall remembers. If you keep a wall warm for a week, it will remember that warmth for 3 days after the fire goes out. He built that way because his father built that way, and his father's father, and somewhere back there, the first man in the line had figured it out by watching the earth itself, how a south-facing hillside stayed workable in winter when the north slope was frozen solid. I asked her when she had understood that the same principle could apply to a room rather than just a wall. She thought about this. When Thomas died, she said, "My husband. He was Cherokee and Tejano both. His grandmother had been born in what is now New Mexico, in a Pueblo community near the Rio Grande. He used to tell me about her house. She called it a winter room. It was built into a hillside with walls of adobe, and the ceiling was low and curved, and in the coldest months of the year, the temperature inside never went below 50 degrees, even with no fire burning. He said she kept her seeds in there, her dried corn, her winter squash. He said the room kept the seeds alive, and the seeds kept the family alive." She paused. Tomas had given up on the ground squirrel and was now attempting to dig into its burrow with a flat piece of shale. After Thomas died, she said, "I had a lot of time to think, and I thought about that room. I thought about how it worked. And I thought, if a room can keep seeds alive through a New Mexico winter, it can keep a child alive through a Montana one. The principle does not care about latitude." This was, I would understand later when I had read more about such things, a fairly precise description of how thermal mass construction operates. But Marta had arrived at it not through reading, but through the slow accumulation of what people she trusted had told her, filtered through her own observation of what she could see and touch and measure with her hands. She brought one more thing to that bank above the oxbow, and it came not from her family's history, but from a 15-year-old boy named Louis Gervais. Louis was Métis, his father a French-Canadian trapper who had come through the valley in the early 1870s, his mother a Cree woman from a family that had wintered in the Yellowstone drainage for 3 generations before the treaty lines pushed most of her people north. Louis lived in the valley year-round, doing day labor for whoever would hire him, which in that community was a shorter list than it should have been. He was a quiet boy, observant in the way that children who spend a great deal of time alone become observant, and he had the kind of practical intelligence that formal schooling, had he ever received much of it, might have organized into something impressive. Marta hired him at 40 cents a day because he was available and because she had looked at him for 30 seconds and decided he was someone who would work steadily and ask useful questions. Both of those assessments proved correct. It was Louis who suggested the final placement of the excavation. He had walked the cut bank with Marta on the first morning, and while she was checking her compass bearing and her survey stakes, he had gone to the base of the bank and pressed both palms flat against the earth face at several different points, moving along it slowly like a man reading something written in a language he needed to concentrate to understand. "Here," he said, stopping at a point 8 feet west of where Marta had positioned her center stake. "My mother taught me this. You feel for the place where the earth is warmest. Not warm like summer, just less cold than the rest. This spot here is holding more than the others." Marta came and pressed her own palm against the face. She moved to the original stake position and pressed her palm there. She moved back to Louis's point. The difference was not dramatic, perhaps 2 degrees, perhaps a little more, but it was consistent. She pressed and released and pressed again, and both times the earth at Louis's point gave back slightly more warmth than the earth at her original choice. "Why this spot?" she asked him. He thought about it. "My mother says the earth here has been catching southern sun for a long time. Longer than one winter. The bank curves a little. You can see it from back there. This section faces a few degrees more south than the rest. Over years, the earth deeper in has held more summer heat. It lets go of it more slowly in winter." Marta moved her center stake to Louis's point. Then she picked up her shovel. "This is the part of the story I was not present for, the first 9 days of excavation, and I have reconstructed it from what Marta told me in pieces over the following months, and from what Louis told me years later when he was a grown man building structures of his own in the hill country west of Billings. It has the quality of reported history, which is to say, it is probably accurate in its essentials and imprecise in its textures, and you should weigh it accordingly. The excavation went well until it did not. The first 4 days proceeded in the methodical way of hard physical labor that has been properly planned. They dug, they moved spoil. They shored the sidewalls with temporary boards as the opening deepened, and by the end of the 4th day, they had a rough box in the earth 9 feet deep, 12 feet wide, 8 feet into the bank. Louis worked without complaint. Tomas, when he was not at the temporary shelter being watched by a neighbor woman who had taken a cautious interest in Marta's project, came and moved small amounts of dirt from one place to another with the deep seriousness of a 5-year-old who considers himself a genuine contributor. On the 5th day, they found the stone. Not a large formation, a shelf of sedimentary rock that ran diagonally across the right rear quadrant of the excavation at a depth of 7 feet, angling down and to the north. It was not an obstacle that could be broken through easily with the tools they had, and it redirected the excavation in a way that compressed the rear right corner and altered the geometry Marta had planned. She sat at the edge of the excavation for an hour after they found it, her notebook open, redrawing the floor plan in several different configurations. Louis sat opposite her and ate a piece of cornbread and did not offer suggestions, which was, I think, exactly the right response to a person who is thinking through a structural problem. The presence of someone sitting quietly nearby is often more useful than the presence of someone talking. What she arrived at was this. She would shift the entire rear wall 1 foot to the left, accepting a slightly asymmetrical floor plan, and she would use the stone shelf itself as the foundation for the rear left corner of the hornito. The stone, she reasoned, would hold heat even more effectively than the adobe mass, and its presence in the wall would add thermal storage rather than subtracting it. The inconvenience became an asset. This is a kind of thinking I have observed in good builders my entire career, not the refusal to accept problems, but the habit of looking at a problem until it shows you what it is actually offering. The adobe brickwork began on the 6th day. The clay came from the riverbank 50 yards south, a blue-gray deposit that Marta had tested before she filed her claim, pressing it between her fingers, rolling it into a thin rope, bending the rope. It held without cracking, which told her it had the right plasticity. The binder was blue stem grass cut from the upper bench and dried for 2 days in the autumn sun. The ratio her father had given her was 3 parts clay to 1 part grass by volume, with water added slowly until the mixture reached the consistency she had been taught to feel for. Louis learned the testing method on the first morning. He was a fast learner with his hands. They built wooden forms, 12 pieces of cottonwood board nailed into open boxes, each producing a brick 14 inches long, 10 inches wide, 4 inches thick. Smaller than the sod bricks that some of the homesteaders used for their above-ground structures, lighter and formed rather than cut. You pack the mixture into the form, struck the top level with a straight board, and set the form in the sun. After 2 days, a properly mixed brick released cleanly from the form and held its shape under hand pressure. The first batch did not release cleanly. 22 bricks, 2 days of drying, a morning of careful anticipation, and when Louis lifted the first form, the brick came apart in a slow crumble, too wet in the center, with small shrinkage cracks running along the top surface. He set the form down and looked at Marta. She was already crouching beside the broken brick, pressing her thumb into the interior. "Too much water," she said. "Not the mixture, the water." She looked up at the sky. The previous day had been still and overcast. Slower evaporation from the surface, faster from the edges, uneven drying through the mass. She turned the broken brick over in her hands and studied the crack pattern. "Cover the next batch with wet burlap for the first day," she said. "Slow the surface down to match the interior. Let them dry at the same rate all the way through. Lewis found 2 burlap sacks in the supply cache, and they cut them into panels. The second batch dried under cover for the first 24 hours and open sky for the second. When Louis lifted the first form on the morning of the third day, the brick came free in one piece. He pressed his thumb into the center. Firm. He pressed harder. It did not yield. He looked at Marta. She took the brick from him and held it in both hands, feeling its weight. Then she set it down on the flat ground, stood up, and put her full weight on it, 130 pounds of woman and winter coat, balanced on a 14-inch rectangle of dried clay and grass. The brick did not crack. "Good," she said, and stepped off and went to lift the next form. I have thought about that moment many times since she told me about it. There is a particular kind of confidence that is not the same as certainty. It is the confidence of someone who has done the work to know what they are looking for and has found it, and who allows themselves one moment of acknowledgement before going back to the work. Marta stepped off that brick and went straight to the next form. She did not look around to see if anyone was watching. Rosa was 30 feet away, sitting against a cottonwood with a blanket over her shoulders and a small book open in her lap. Rosa was not coughing that morning. The work of laying the walls began on the 11th day. This is where, had I been present, I would have had the most to say, because laying adobe brick is not the same as laying timber framing, and the skills transfer only imperfectly. But Marta had her father's instructions in her notebook, the precise lean of each course, the way the vertical joints were offset from course to course, the method of pressing each new brick into its mortar bed and then tapping the face with the heel of the hand to seat it, and Lewis had hands that followed instruction accurately and without needing it repeated. The walls rose. I came out on the 14th day with the walls at shoulder height on the exterior and the double-sealed surface treatment already applied to the lower 3 feet of the interior. I stood at the entry opening and looked in. The space was dim and smelled of wet clay and dry grass and the particular mineral scent of excavated earth that has not seen air in a long time. I pressed my palm flat against the interior wall surface. It was, I would have said without thinking, the temperature of skin, not cold, not warm in the way a heated surface is warm, simply even, consistent. The same when I moved my hand 6 inches to the left, or 6 inches higher, or pressed into the corner where the wall met the excavated earth of the bank. I left without saying anything to Marta, who was on the exterior scaffolding, checking the alignment of the upper course. She saw me go. She did not call after me. That evening I opened my workbook to the page I had titled Vasquez Method, and I wrote for 2 hours. I wrote about the clay composition and the brick dimensions and the multi-layer surface treatment. I wrote about what I had felt when I put my hand on the wall. I wrote, even temperature across entire interior surface. No cold corner. No variance. Like touching something that has decided on a temperature and intends to keep it. I looked at that last sentence for a while. Then I wrote below it, this is not how I was taught to think about walls. There is a thing that happens to the light in Montana in late October that I have never been able to describe to someone who has not seen it. It is not a dimming exactly. The days are shorter, yes, and the sun tracks lower across the south, but that is true everywhere at that latitude, and it is not what I mean. What I mean is a quality of the light itself, a flatness, a kind of withdrawal, as though the sun has decided to be present without being committed. The grass on the upper bench goes the color of old paper. The river slows its color from green-brown to something closer to iron. The shadows at midday have the same lean as the shadows at 4 in the afternoon, and there is a stillness in the middle hours of the day that has no summer equivalent. Animals notice it. Horses stand facing south in their paddocks with the patient attention of things that know something is coming and have accepted that knowing is all they can do about it. The settlers noticed it too, in their way. October was when the wood-cutting intensified, when the banking of the house foundations with straw and earth became urgent, when children were kept closer to the homestead and errands to Miles City were consolidated or postponed. There was a particular behavior I observed every autumn in the families along the valley, a shortening of range, a drawing inward, like a hand closing slowly around what it holds. Marta Vasquez was, in October of 1883, doing the opposite. The Hornito took 4 days to build, and I was present for 2 of them. I had stopped pretending I came out to the Carry Quarter section for reasons other than what I was actually there for, which was to watch a building method I did not understand and could not yet evaluate being executed with a precision that made me uncomfortable in ways I was still sorting out. I told myself I came to watch for structural problems. This was true enough to serve. The Hornito was built into the rear wall of the dugout at roughly the center point, positioned so that its mass occupied approximately 1/3 of the wall's depth. This is the feature that distinguished it most fundamentally from the stove arrangements I had spent my career building around. In a conventional Montana home, the iron stove stood in the room, separate from the structure, heating the air between its surface and the walls. The walls received that heat secondhand, if they received it at all, and conducted most of it back outside within hours. What Marta built was different in its intention from the ground up. The firebox was a clay-lined chamber set within the wall's adobe mass, roughly the size of a large bread oven, 18 inches wide, 14 inches tall, 22 inches deep. The opening faced the room at a low height, designed for small fuel, split cottonwood pieces no longer than a man's forearm, burning in short cycles morning and evening rather than sustained all day. Above the firebox, running vertically through the upper section of the wall, was a clay-lined flue that exited through the top of the wall and then straight up through a short stack above the roofline. No long diagonal tunnel through the earth, no complex draft calculation. The path was direct and the draw was reliable. The principle, as Marta explained it to me while Lewis laid the upper courses of the firebox surround, was this. The fire's heat did not go primarily into the room, it went into the wall. The adobe mass surrounding the firebox, which extended 18 inches to either side and ran from floor to ceiling, absorbed that heat the way a stone absorbs afternoon sun, slowly and deeply, storing it in its thermal mass the way a cistern stores water. Hours after the fire went to coals and the coals went to ash, the wall was still giving back that stored warmth. Not the fierce, directional heat of an iron stove running hard, but a slow, even radiation from a large surface, the entire rear third of the room, floor to ceiling, releasing heat at approximately the rate at which the room lost it. The fire is not for the room, Marta told me. The fire is for the wall. The wall is for the room. You are always working one step back from where it looks like you are working. I wrote that down when I got home. The ceiling presented the final significant challenge, and it was the part of the construction that caused me the most professional anxiety as I watched it take shape. Marta had explained the curved ceiling geometry to me at our first meeting, and the logic of it had satisfied me in the abstract. An arch distributes load to its supports rather than concentrating it at the span's center, which is why Roman aqueducts are still standing while flat-roofed structures of the same era are rubble. But knowing a principle and trusting a specific execution of it are different things, and watching a 34-year-old woman and a 15-year-old boy set cottonwood poles into clay-packed sockets and begin weaving willow branches between them in a cold Montana October produced in me a sustained internal argument between what I understood structurally and what I had been trained to consider acceptable practice. The poles were sound. I had checked them myself, running my hand along each one before it went up, feeling for soft spots, checking the grain at the cut ends. 12 poles, 6 inches at their widest, set at 20-inch intervals across the 12-foot span. Sufficient, by my calculation, for the load Marta was proposing, with a margin I would have preferred to be larger, but could not honestly call inadequate. The willow lattice went over the poles in 2 diagonal layers, bound at each crossing with strips of wet rawhide that would shrink and tighten as they dried. Over this went a layer of canvas, $8 worth, the single largest material expenditure after the clay pipe for the flue, stretched and tacked. Over the canvas went earth, tamped in 3-inch lifts, 12 inches of total depth, weighing, as I calculated it, somewhere between 2.5 and 3 tons. The poles did not shift. The lattice did not creak. The ceiling held its gentle curve with the self-possessed solidity of something that has been built the way it was built because that is the way it should be built. I checked the center point deflection with a straight edge on the morning after the final earth layer went down. 4/16 of an inch. I put the straight edge away. Marta moved her children in on the 15th of November. I know the date because I noted it in my workbook, along with the air temperature that morning, which was 17 degrees above zero and falling with a northwest wind that put the felt temperature lower. It was not yet a serious cold by Montana standards, but it was serious enough, and the temporary shelter Marta and her children had been occupying since September was the kind of structure that had opinions about 17-degree mornings. Rosa went through the doorway first, carrying a bundle of her own things. Tomas followed with a cooking pot held in both arms. Marta came last, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before ducking through, not in the manner of hesitation, but in the manner of a person marking a thing that deserves to be marked. She did not come back outside until mid-morning. When she did, she looked, as nearly as I can describe it, like someone who had set down something heavy. Not the specific happiness of celebration, but the deeper, quieter settling of a person who has been holding themselves in readiness for a long time and has finally been given permission to breathe at the normal rate. Rosa was with her, not coughing. The cold that came in January of 1884 arrived without a storm. This is the part of the story that people from outside Montana have the most difficulty picturing, because when they think of dangerous winter weather, they think of blizzards, wind and snow and the howling drama of a system moving through. The blizzard announces itself. It gives you hours of preparation, and the noise of it, terrible as it is, confirms that the thing you are enduring is finite, that it will pass, that when the sound stops, the worst has stopped. The still cold does not work that way. It builds in clear weather, under skies so cloudless and dark at night that the stars look close enough to be a concern. The temperature drops after sunset and does not recover through the day. It drops the next night further, and the next. There is no wind to give the cold a voice, no cloud cover to insulate the ground against the radiant heat loss that accelerates on clear nights. The earth gives its warmth back to the sky with nothing to stop it, and the sky takes everything offered and asks for more. A man from Miles City came through on the 28th of December. He was a provisioner, knew the country, had been reading skies and wind and animal behavior for 2 decades. He stopped at each homestead along the valley road. What he said was simple. He had seen the signs of this kind of cold before. The last time it had come like this, clear, still, building slowly, it had gone to 41 below and stayed there for 4 days. That had been in 1875. He believed this one would be worse. He told the families to check their wood supplies and check them honestly. He told them that if their wood was short, now was the time to know it, while there was still time to address the fact. He stopped at the cut bank above the oxbow on his way east. Marta listened to him from the doorway of the dugout, the thin line of smoke from the hornito rising straight and steady in the windless air above the roofline. She thanked him for the information. She told him she had 8 pounds of split cottonwood inside and another 90 pounds stacked against the exterior wall, under canvas. The provisioner looked at the stack. He looked at the smoke thread above the roof. He looked at Marta. "That won't be enough," he said. "Not if I'm right about this cold, it will be enough," Marta said. She said it the way her father had said things about his walls, not with the heat of argument, but with the flat certainty of someone reporting a measurement they had already taken. The provisioner rode on. He had other stops to make, and he had learned in 20 years of frontier provisioning that there were two kinds of people who would not be moved from a decision: fools and those who knew something he did not. He had not yet determined, in Marta's case, which kind he was dealing with. In 36 hours, the cold began to come. The cold came the way the provisioner said it would. No wind, no snow, just a deepening, night after night, of something that had no sound, and no movement, and no mercy. On the morning of the 2nd day of January, the thermometer Hal had hung near the entry of the dugout. He had left it there on his last visit, without comment, and Marta had left it hanging, read 31 below zero before the sun cleared the eastern bench. By mid-afternoon it had risen to 26 below. That was the warmest it would get for 3 days. Inside the dugout, without any fire burning since the previous evening, the temperature was 53 degrees. Marta lit the hornito at 7 in the morning. She used 6 pounds of split cottonwood, pieces the length of her forearm, as the design required. Burning in a shallow bed of coals she kept alive with the minimum of fuel needed to sustain combustion. She was not heating the room. She was feeding the wall. By 9 o'clock the interior temperature had climbed to 61 degrees. By 10 she let the fire go to coals. The wall continued its work without the fire's assistance, releasing what it had absorbed through the night and the hour of burning, and the temperature held at 59 degrees through the afternoon without any additional fuel. Rosa sat at the small table near the entry and copied letters from a primer Ingrid Lindqvist had lent her. Tomas slept on the rope bed for 2 hours in the afternoon, which was unusual for him and suggested the close air and the deep quiet outside had reached even a 5-year-old's nervous system. Marta cooked, read, checked the thermometer at intervals, and noted each reading in her workbook. She also noted, with the precise and unsentimental record-keeping of someone who knows that numbers will be needed later, the temperature differential. On the first morning, 53 inside, 31 below outside. A differential of 84 degrees maintained by 12 inches of tamped earth above, 36 inches of adobe to the sides and front, and 9 feet of undisturbed hillside at the rear, with a fire that had burned for less than 2 hours in the previous 16. On the morning of the 3rd day, the temperature outside dropped to 44 below zero. Inside the dugout it was 52 degrees. Rosa did not cough. What was happening elsewhere in the valley during those 3 days I know partly from my own experience and partly from what others told me afterward, in the way that communities reconstruct the shared ordeal of a hard event once the event has passed and it is safe to compare notes. Lars Lindqvist burned through his cut wood on the afternoon of the 2nd day. He had believed his supply was adequate. It would have been adequate for any winter he had previously encountered in Montana. He broke apart a small outbuilding that had been used for storing harness and burned the lumber in pieces through the 2nd night. His family survived. His youngest son developed a persistent cough that lasted through February. The boy recovered fully by spring, but Lars did not speak of that winter without a particular set to his jaw that I recognized as the expression of a man who has looked directly at the consequences of his own miscalculation and has not forgiven himself for it. I spent those 3 days in my own house, which was a well-built timber structure with a good iron stove and a wood supply I had laid in carefully. I was not in danger. I was cold in the corners of rooms and cold in the mornings before the stove recovered from the night, and I burned 42 pounds of wood on the coldest day, which was more than I had ever burned in a single day, and which I noted in my workbook with the same instinct for documentation that the cold itself seemed to demand. On the morning of the 4th day I rode out to the cut bank. Marta was outside when I arrived, splitting the morning's fuel. The cold had broken overnight. It was still 15 below, but the quality of the air had changed. The particular held-breath stillness had released, and 15 below in moving air was a thing a Montana winter offered regularly enough that it had lost its power to astonish. She was working in a wool coat, and her breath made small, steady clouds in the air above her. I dismounted and stood at the paddock rail. I did not say anything immediately. There was, I had found, A great deal that did not need to be said in the first moments of arriving at a place you had doubted. She set down the splitting maul and looked at me. "Come inside," she said. I ducked through the doorway. The warmth was, as it had been every time I entered that space, immediate and enveloping, in a way that no iron stove in a timber frame room had ever quite replicated. Not the fierce directional heat of a stove running at capacity, but something that came from everywhere and from nowhere specific, from the walls and the floor and the low curved ceiling. The whole interior surface of the room contributing equally to a temperature that had no cold spots and no drafts, and no corners where a child's fingers would go numb while the rest of her was warm enough. I stood in the center of the room. 53 degrees, the thermometer read, no fire currently burning. Outside, 15 below. I took out my workbook. The changes that followed came in the way that real changes usually come. Not as announcements, but as quiet adjustments made by people who had absorbed a lesson they were not entirely ready to attribute out loud. Lars Lindqvist came to Marta in March. Once the cold had broken and the valley had returned to the provisional normalcy of a Montana late winter. He came in the morning on a Tuesday when he knew Ingrid was visiting her neighbor to the west and would not see him go. He knocked at the dugout door and asked Marta if she would explain the wall construction to him, not the whole method, just the wall. He had decided to bank earth against the north and west sides of his house before the next winter, and he wanted to understand the principles before he began. Marta explained it to him for the better part of an hour. She drew the cross-section in her workbook and showed him the proportions. She told him about the ceiling layers and why each one had a different composition. She told him about the importance of doing the work in fall, before the first hard frost, so the material could settle and cure before it was needed. Lars listened. He asked 2 or 3 questions that were technically precise and indicated he had been thinking about the problem carefully before coming. He thanked her and rode home. He never, in my hearing, attributed the modification to anyone. When a man from Miles City came through the following autumn and noticed the earthen banking and asked about it, Lars said he had read about the technique somewhere. I was standing nearby when he said it. I looked at my boots. Ingrid came separately. She came openly in the afternoon, and she brought her daughter. She told Marta she wanted to learn to make the ceiling compound, the final interior layer, the clay and sand and limestone mixture her father had used in San Antonio. She wanted to apply it to the interior of her root cellar, which sweated in spring and bred the kind of damp that spoiled stored vegetables. Marta taught her. They sat on the dugout floor with a bowl between them, and Marta showed her how to test the mixture and how to work it into the surface with a wet cloth in small circular motions that forced it into the pores of whatever it was applied to. Ingrid's daughter watched. Rosa sat nearby, reading. Those 2 women on that floor, working a material that Marta's father had worked in Texas and his father before him, that is the image I return to most often when I think about what Marta built in the autumn of 1883. Not the temperature differential on the coldest night, not the hornito or the curved ceiling or the precise composition of the adobe mix. Those things matter. I have documented them carefully, and I stand behind their importance. But the image I return to is Ingrid Lindqvist's hands learning a new motion, and her daughter watching, and Rosa not coughing. Marta Vasquez lived in that dugout until 1918, when the influenza came through the valley and took her in 4 days. She was 69 years old. She had outlasted 3 of her neighbors, both of her original skeptics among the men, and the provisional structure that everyone in the fall of 1883 had given until spring. Rosa still lives there. She is in her 40s now, the age her mother was when I first rode out to the cut bank and spent 2 hours explaining, with considerable confidence, the reasons the thing her mother was building would not work. Rosa has added a second room off the north side, using her mother's method, and the combined structure is the warmest inhabited building in the valley in winter and the coolest in August. She keeps her mother's workbook in a box on the shelf above the table where she once copied letters from a primer. Louis Gervais is 55 years old and living west of Billings. He builds in earth and adobe and the hybrid methods that combine both, and he teaches what he knows to anyone who will pay attention. He still calls the technique, when he names it at all, the Vasquez method. Not many people know what the name refers to. I have made it a habit in the last several years of explaining it when the opportunity arises. I am 71 years old. I have driven more nails into Montana wood than I could count in a day of counting. I have built good structures and learned from poor ones, and I have had the ordinary craftsman's education in the difference between what you plan and what the material will allow. But I have thought about those walls, Marta's walls, more than I have thought about any structure I built myself. I have thought about what it means that a woman with a dying husband's stories and a father's notebook and a 15-year-old boy's palms pressed against a riverbank arrived at a better answer than I had found in 30 years of professional practice. I have thought about what kind of knowledge that is and where it lives and why it is so easy to lose. My nephew Arvid is going east to learn construction engineering. He will learn things I do not know. He will come back with the language for things that people like Marta understood without language, and that language will be useful to him. But I have told him, before he goes, what I told you at the beginning. The finest piece of work I ever saw was not mine. It was built by a woman who understood that a wall was not a barrier against cold, but a vessel for warmth, that you did not fight the winter, you stored the summer and let the stored summer do the work. She learned it from her father and her husband and a boy whose mother knew how to read the temperature of a riverbank with the palms of her hands. The cold that winter went to 44 below. Inside those walls it was 52 degrees. Rosa did not cough. That is the whole story. The numbers are the proof, but the story is in the walls, and the walls are still standing, and on a clear night in January when the temperature drops and the stars come close, they are still, after 40 years, remembering summer.